But if you keep the population down so the babies aren't fed on too much.
Do you remove after each?
When they fledge. Mm-hmm.
See,
Yeah.
I looked online and I need to clean out into the season, but I had one fledge a week ago and I've already got another pair.
Yeah, sometimes they're really fast.
But I don't know that it's them.
It's probably another pair.
I think it's another pair, and I've got another box, and they couldn't decide between. And then they chose the one that they just left. I mean, it was like the same day we already had another pair looking at that one.
If they build on Airbnb, they need to keep it rented. They got some little farm that have eggs in the nest now, and I didn't know whether to take that.
Well, if you think you've had mites, and it's really gross, when the babies leave, the mites have nothing to feed on, so they start to move around. And you can open up the box and there'll be these they're little tiny, like salt and pepper, all over the box, and they're just crawling all over the place. And they will get on you. They don't like feeding on us because our body temperatures are not as high as bluebirds. So they don't stay on us, but it's really nasty to have these things come running up your arm. So I recommend if you can't get in there and you know there's a lot of mites in that nest, you can use 7 dust, which is just a garden dust, and just sprinkle it on the nesting material. If you have eggs, you can carefully take them out and then sprinkle the 7 on the nesting material and shake the nest, and the 7 will penetrate down into the nesting material and keep the mite populations down. So 7 is really pretty safe to use around birds. Just don't cake it in there. Don't feed it to them, yeah. And when you take your nesting materials out, I recommend wearing gloves and also one of those particle masks, because there's a lot of feather debris and body skin cells and nasty stuff in there, especially if you're immunocompromised. You don't want to be breathing in that stuff. So be careful when you're taking it out.
I never did that. I never saw little mites, did you?
Well, they were probably there, but, We ready?
Yes, we are. Hello. Good morning. So, hello to returning visitors. So welcome. If you don't know, this is the Sanctuary at Berry Lecture Series, and today we are going to be talking about bluebirds. But what this lecture series is something that we have created to pair with our Sanctuary at Berry wildlife photography exhibition. And so that is, for many of you I think have already seen it, but that exhibition is really just a celebration of the diversity of wildlife found here at Berry, and we're able to show it to you through the wonderful photography of Gena Flanigen. Gena would normally be here for our lectures, but as is only fitting, she is out birding. And so if you'll forgive her, she sends her apologies, but hopefully we will all benefit from the photographs she's able to capture today at a later date. But we thankfully have the wonderful Dr. Reneé Carleton here with us today. And so she's going to be talking about the bluebirds, and then we'll have a time for questions afterwards. And then after that, you're welcome to enjoy the gallery, and I'll be there to answer any questions you have to the best of my ability. And then I think that'll kind of wrap us up. So it's a beautiful day ahead of us, so we're going to learn about this. But for those of you who don't know about Dr. Carleton, she came to Berry in 2000, started teaching here. She received her PhD from the University of Georgia, and prior to that received her DVM from the University of Florida. She brings to Berry a wonderful wealth of knowledge about general biology, and that's primarily what she teaches. But her research interest is just absolutely fascinating. I hope one day to maybe pick your brain about it, but it's actually aviation parasites and diseases, which may have been some of the discussion that I was walking in on a little bit.
It might be.
Yeah. Oh man, it's already started. Okay, well, so I am going to get out of y'all's way, but obviously y'all know of her work with, or many of you know of her work with the eagles and may have come to the eagle lecture that we had, but today we're getting to talk about one of her first loves and maybe still major loves of the bluebird. So enjoy, and afterwards, like I said, we'll have questions and then time to explore the gallery. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Rachel. All right, well, thank you all for coming today. I know probably everybody has to go home this afternoon and cut grass because it's all this tall now with all the rain that we've had. I know mine is about like that, so that's my plans for today. But anyway, I'm going to give you some lessons all about bluebirds, and all of the photographs that I'm using in my presentation were taken by Gena, and she's just a fabulous photographer. She has such an instinct for capturing really the personalities of her subjects, and she's taken a lot of pictures of bluebirds and kindly has let me use them for not only this presentation but some of the other ones that I've done. And as Rachel said, I'm an associate professor of biology here at Berry College, and I've been here for quite a number of years, and I've been really working with the bluebirds here since 2002, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But one thing, got to press that button, did we do? Okay, come on, button, press. Rachel! All right, maybe I have to do this one. We're not moving forward.
Might be the clicker interfering.
Okay.
Interesting.
There we go. Okay, yay. Yay. Okay. All right. All right, so one thing that I want to emphasize is that not all bluebirds are bluebirds. And so I'm showing here some examples of blue birds, and those are birds that have blue coloration, such as blue jays. That next one here is a Steller's jay. Now, we don't have Steller's jay here. That's a western type of bird, but I wanted to give you another example of a blue-colored bird. The one in the middle is a blue grosbeak, which we have here in Georgia. The one over on my left, your right, would be an indigo bunting, which are also here. Beautiful. Look at the coloration there. And then below that is a type of warbler called a black-throated blue. Now, black-throated blues move through our part of northwest Georgia, but they're really breeders up in the northeastern mountains of Georgia and up into Tennessee and the Appalachians. But except for the Stellers, we have a chance of observing all of these particular blue birds here in Rome. And let's see if I can do this right. There we go. All right, so bluebird is one word when we're speaking about this particular genus of small thrushes that have blue coloration. And there are 3 species within the genus. Cialia, that's the Latin name for this particular genus. Cialis is the species epithet for eastern bluebirds, and that's the species we have here, and is also very common in the eastern part of the United States. So we have 3 species, the eastern bluebird, the western bluebird, and then there's a mountain bluebird. And this is our eastern bluebird. Notice that around the throat, that chestnutty, rusty coloration goes from below the throat down to the breast and upward just a little bit toward the back of the neck. But this is a male, and you can see how brilliantly blue he's colored also with the little white tummy patch. If we go to, just a minute. I did this again. There we go. See, I'm technologically inept. There we go. Okay. All these computers are so different. All right, so these are the other species of bluebirds. The top one is the mountain bluebird, and these are going to be found in higher elevations out in the western part of the country. Montana, Nevada, up into Oregon. And you can see that the blue coloration is much different than what we have on the eastern and the western, which we have below. So our westerns, again, are found in the western part of the United States, down a little bit into the southwest. But the blue coloration extends down underneath the throat instead of where the red coloration of the eastern bluebird comes up on the throat. So those are our two other species, which unfortunately we won't see here, although this spring, one mountain bluebird oddly showed up in Augusta for a short period of time. We think it was blown in by one of the storms that were coming across. So fortunately, some people got to see it. I didn't, but that would be a really, really, really rare occurrence. So this is the distribution of eastern bluebirds. You can see that, you know, pretty much east of the Mississippi is where most of the populations are going to be found. We're in an area where we have permanent residents. Our bluebirds don't migrate in the wintertime. They're going to stay here all year round. The ones that are in the upper tier states will come down. They're short distance migrants. They're not going to travel all the way down into Central and South America like some of the neotropical migrants do, but they can come into our area. So in the wintertime, we may be seeing some birds that are from, say, Michigan and Wisconsin. Depending on the temperature, it will influence how far they'll actually travel. So if there's a really mild winter up north, the movement is not going to be like it would be if the winters are more severe. Now, 2 states have chosen eastern bluebirds to be their state bird, and that's Missouri and New York, and also eastern bluebirds were chosen to represent the 3 cent, I'm sure there are no more of these around, 3 cents. So there's a very nice illustration of a bluebird on a stamp. Now, as you probably know, bluebirds are what we call sexually dimorphic. Di means two and morphic means characteristics or physical traits. So we have a different coloration for both the male and the female. The males are the bright, bright blue over most of the upper portion of his body, and what I'm doing here is I'm extending out the wings so you can see how the coloration varies between male and female. The females are blue, but they're a duller blue, more of a slate grayish type of blue, and you can see her head is a little bit more gray as I'm holding her in that particular photograph. So it's very easy to tell male versus female, whereas some other birds that are not sexually dimorphic, they're monomorphic or one trait, it's very hard to identify male versus female. All right, so I'm going to give you a simple test. Which one's the male and which one's the female? Right, that's our female, and then there's our male over there. So very easy to tell them apart. So if you have a pair of bluebirds, it should be easy for you to know which one's the boy and which one's the girl, or Mr. and Mrs. All right, so I'll give you a little bit of bluebird ecology. On average, they live in the wild about 6 years. And that's not too bad for a small thrush of that size. Now, certainly there are longer-lived birds and there are shorter-lived birds, but that's really pretty good, 6 years. As far as their food choices, they are primarily insectivores, meaning they consume insects, and they'll do that spring, summer, fall, and even here in the wintertime, because if you go out when we're having mild days, there are some bugs running around, so they'll consume those in the winter too. In the wintertime, they're going to be consuming or adding to their diet small fruits. So to encourage or to help them, you can plant in your landscape shrubbery or trees or other types of vegetation that would provide small fruits for them. I really don't like Chinese privet. It's a pest. It's an invasive species here, but it produces some really, really nice little blueberries that bluebirds like. Other birds like it too, and that's why there's so much Chinese privet around, because the seeds pass out in their droppings after they've digested the soft part of the fruits. But other choices for landscape vegetation that provide food would be things like wax myrtle, which has little white berries, and other species of birds will also consume those. Some of the hollies that produce the red berries are very good. Dogwood produces berries that birds will consume in the fall as they're moving through. So there are lots of options that you can add to your landscape that are native and provide food sources that support not only bluebirds but other species as well. Now, bluebirds hunt from some elevated surface. They're not like robins, which run across the ground and find an insect and then capture it. So bluebirds are scouting from some elevated position. We call that hawking. If you think about a hawk that you've seen sitting on a power line, they're scanning the area below them, and when they see something, then they'll fly down and pounce on it and capture that prey. And bluebirds basically hunt the same way. So they'll sit on power lines, fences, the wire of fences, fence posts. Also, they like to hunt from overhanging tree limbs. And they will go and pick insects, caterpillars especially, out of trees. So having oaks and hickories and native trees around is very good for them too. As I said, our southern populations are non-migratory, so they're going to be here all year round. And then they have very distinct habitat preferences. So I get a lot of questions frequently about, well, I would love to have bluebirds in my yard, but I never seem to see them around. Why is that? And it's because of their habitat preferences, which, if we look at this picture, this is the typical habitat where you would find bluebirds. They want to have nice open spaces with relatively short grass, but that space is bordered by a tree line with lots of overhanging limbs. And they'll come into this area if there's some shrubs or brush that are sticking up. They'll land on that and look for the insects, or they may see them as they're flying from one position to another. But a lot of times they're going to be in that border of trees looking for food to feed not only themselves but also their babies. So when we have an in-town type of lot with lots of trees and not a lot of lawn space, you're probably not going to have bluebirds. Now, it's not uncommon to see them in the wintertime in that type of habitat because they disperse in the wintertime and they move out of this open area. You're less likely to have a lot of insects here because the vegetation dries down or dies down, but you're going to have some vegetation usually in a landscape. So they're going to be in more shrubby areas in the wintertime. So that's the primary type of habitat that they prefer. Big lawns, parkland areas, old orchards, old farmland where there's a lot of cleared areas. Also, sometimes bordering a river walk where there's a lot of space there. You may see them there. All right, so nests and young, naturally that's going to come along after we have bluebirds in an area. They are obligate secondary cavity nesters. Now, obligate means that they must nest inside of a cavity. They don't build their nests just in a bush like a robin would. They have to be inside an enclosed area. And secondary cavity nesters means that they rely on an existing hole or cavity. They cannot excavate their own cavities. So they're not like woodpeckers, which can start a brand new hole and bring out all of that wood material in order to create a cavity, but they rely on an existing cavity in order to nest. And that's been a bit of a problem for them. Especially in the early 70s, from about 1940 through 1970, bluebirds started to go through a pretty drastic decline, and in some areas they lost up to 90% of the population, primarily because of habitat conversion, where taking away that habitat to put in subdivisions or malls or whatever, removing that farmland, but we were taking away the natural cavities that the birds depend on. Old tree dies, or fences are no longer there that might have a rotted area in those. There were no cavities for those birds. And also with the explosion of European starlings that started in New York City and has moved throughout really the entire United States, starlings are also cavity nesters, and they're very aggressive cavity nesters. They displaced a lot of the bluebirds, and that resulted in this very, very severe population decline. Fortunately, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, nest boxes provide a superb cavity for these birds to nest in. And if you build your nest box right, you can exclude starlings and some of the other species that would compete with the bluebirds. So here's a little clutch of babies that are inside one of my nest boxes, and you can see that these little guys are only a day or so old, and there's, looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 5 in there. The clutch size, a clutch is how many eggs a female lays, is from 1 to 6 eggs. I occasionally get 6. Most often I get about 4 or 5. And she lays those eggs sequentially. So every day she'll lay 1 egg, and she doesn't actually start incubating them until she's laid the last egg. The female does all of the nest building. The male finds a suitable cavity, and he will introduce his mate to that cavity, but it's up to her to do the rest of the nest building. So she'll gather up dried grasses. This particular female, you can see there's a combination of dried grass and pine straw in that particular box. And I've had some females build a nest entirely out of pine straw, so they do have some little bit of preferences. But she'll line that nest box, she'll twirl herself around to form a cup, and within that cup, that's where she deposits her eggs. Then she can produce 2 to 4 broods per season. If we have a really mild spring that's not too rainy and not too cold, where she can start building a nest earlier, she could, if she's in really good condition and in very good habitat, produce up to 4 clutches or 4 broods. More likely up north, or more of the averages, they're going to get 2 broods per season. And I would say on average here, I'm seeing about 3. So depends on the age of the female and the conditions, but they can be relatively very productive. All right, so incubation is 12 days. So as soon as she's deposited that last egg, she'll start incubating them. So the early eggs kind of go into a suspended animation, and they don't actually start development until her body heat starts to stimulate that. But incubation is 12 days, and after the babies hatch, they're in the box for, on average, 19 days. So that's a very, very rapid rate of development from hatching to the time where they can fledge or leave the nest box for the first time. So here's a little baby that I just happened to find just hatching. It's not even quite out of the egg yet. And they're born basically naked. There's a few little feathers there. The eyes are not fully developed yet. There's no opening for the ears, and they're really more or less at the embryo state. But they're going to grow very, very quickly. So that's just hatching. All right, this one is 2 hours old. So now it's started to dry out a little bit, and you can see the little bit of fluffy feathering it has, but you can see that the eyes are very, very large, but they're not open, they're still developing. The skin is very, very thin and pink, and you can actually see the internal organs through that thin skin. The feet are not quite formed all the way yet. You can see there's little toes there starting to show up, but they're not quite looking like toes that the little bird will have later on. And we call these Altricial, meaning that they're born basically blind, naked, and completely dependent on their parents for care. The female must continue to incubate them because they are not capable of generating their own body heat at this stage. Now there's another type of reproduction that's called precocial, and that's like our little chicks and ducklings, where as soon as they hatch, within an hour or so, they're able to move around and follow their moms, like a precocious kid. So there's 2 modes of reproduction, and these are altricial.
Is it just a myth you aren't supposed to touch the egg?
Yeah, that's pretty much an old wives' tale. Birds do not have particularly a good sense of smell.
So after that, you would put that back in the
I put it back in the box,
and the mother comes
and the mother comes back. A lot of times I'm a bird bander, and for quite a long time I was banding all of the bluebirds. I'm not banding them all right now, but I would catch the parents inside of the box when they would go in to feed the babies, band them, release them, and within 30 minutes they were back feeding the babies. I've only had one brood that was abandoned, and I've banded probably 1,600 bluebirds. So they pretty much are going to go right back and start feeding babies again. So I think that don't touch them because they'll know, the parents will know that you were there, came about so that kids wouldn't go to a nest and disturb them, and because when you're going to a nest you have a potential to attract predators. And there are a few species of birds that can be disturbed enough that they will abandon a brood, but bluebirds are not like that. So you can check on the babies. If you have your own box, that's not going to bother the parents. They may not like it, they may fuss at you and maybe even fly at you, but you're not going to dissuade them from coming back. All right, so that's a little 2-hour-old one. That's 10 days. Look at how much growth we've had in that short period of time. So now we have, the eyes are open, you can see the little ear hole, starting to look like a bird, not like a little alien, and there are pin feathers that are coming in pretty well. We're even getting the flight feathers that are growing in, still a little stubby tail, and there's a few wisps of the downy feathers that are left. But that's still a pretty young baby, so we think that's 10 days old. That's a lot of insects that those parents have gone out and captured with high protein to get this little baby to that state. And then we just go 3 days more, look at how much more development we have. Right? This bird is almost completely feathered. You can see even blue on the feathers, and this is a female. I can tell the gender at 13 days old by the amount of blue that's on the wing feathers. So now, you know, there's still a few little wisps of the downy feathers, but it looks like a little bird now pretty much. And 13 days old is the last day that I can handle them. If I try to handle them after day 13, the babies are cognizant enough that they get very disturbed and scared, and they will actually leave the box, and if you try to put them back in, they'll come out again. But they're not capable of flight at that stage, and the parents, oddly enough, don't recognize little babies on the ground as their babies until those kids can fly. So if you're checking your boxes, don't check it after day 13. All right, now I'm going to show you the next picture, which is day 15. There we go. So this is at 15 days old. And what I did here is I just quickly lifted the lid and took a photograph. But now, those kids, you can see how crowded it gets in that box when you've got 5 that are in there. And we're starting to get a little bit of little messiness in there. But in a bluebird nest, bluebird parents remove what's called a fecal sac. When the babies go to the bathroom, that fecal material is covered in kind of a mucousy sac, and the parents pick that up and carry it off so that they keep the nest rather sanitary. Not all birds do that, but because they're in a cavity, you can imagine you need to keep things a little bit cleaner. And so nature has provided these birds with a behavior to carry that stuff away and keep the nest as clean as possible. So that's at 15 days old, and I would call these guys pre-fledged. Not quite able to fly yet, but they will very soon. And typically, as I said, they fledge at day 19. This is a young fledgling at day 22, and you see that they're speckled. They'll lose those speckles after they molt for the first time and start getting in their true adult plumage. So here's a little kid that's just come out of the box within a few days. Typically what they're going to do is after they leave the box, they're going to fly to a tree somewhere that has pretty dense in vegetation where they're protected and they're not too obvious, and the parents will come and feed them. And then As they get a little more mature, they learn to fly a little bit better. They'll follow their parents around, and they'll stay with the parents for anywhere from 2 weeks to about a month, learning how to catch food on their own. And if it's earlier in the season, actually, a lot of broods will do this. Some of the kids will stay back and stay with the parents and help with the next brood. So they may actually catch insects and bring them in and feed the next babies. They're not exactly siblings, but they're still, of course, very related. So that's what a very young bluebird looks like. Okay, so here's a picture Gena took at a creek on her property. And here's 2 birds that have just taken a nice, refreshing bath. That's Dad over there on the left. And this one is a fledgling. Notice that they're basically the same size. The color is a bit muted on this one because of the lighting and, of course, the feathers being wet. But I can see some speckling there, so I know that that's a fledgling. But basically, once they leave the box, they weigh the same. They're the same size as their parents. They just need to hone their survival skills a little bit better. Okay, go back. All right, so what I want to talk about next is my nest box program and how you can help bluebirds by having nest boxes. As I said before, one of the major reasons for that decline that bluebirds went through in the 70s is because of the lack of natural nesting cavities. And there was a movement, that was the age of conservation back then, but there was a movement to bring bluebirds back, and many people started initiating nest box programs and establishing bluebird trails. And this was very, very prominent in the Northeast where much of the decline went on. And so thanks to a gentleman by the name of Lawrence Zelleny and what then became the North American Bluebird Society, plans for building boxes became available, and people started building nest boxes and providing places for these birds to nest. So here's one of my boxes with a pair that's checking it out. And this is a rather simple design. What I use is a box that has a hinged lid so that I can reach in and capture the birds when they're inside the nest box. And I do that because I do research on them. Now, for most people, I think it's more convenient to have a side opening box because it's easier for you to get in there to do your clean outs when a brood is fledged. So I use either white pine, or this particular box is western red cedar. I don't paint my boxes, although I have painted some of them. We were looking for time at temperature inside the box and whether a dark box versus a light box made any difference, and it really didn't. But this is a natural wood box. And I put my boxes together using decking screws, so that if I need to replace a part, I can do that pretty easily without having to deal with staples or nails. And so you can see, if you look closely, the decking screws that are holding that box together. This is an older North American Bluebird Society design. They've modified it a bit, but there are lots and lots of plans available if you are handy and you want to make your own boxes. I know that Viking Furniture used my box plan to make boxes that are for sale. I'm not sure, Rachel, are there any over at the museum gift shop? Okay, if you want to buy an official Berry Bluebird box, you can contact Viking Furniture and they'll set you up. But it's basically my design with a little bit of a modification.
Do they need any kind of ventilation?
They do. Now, on this particular box, I have drilled 2 holes in the side. There's a pair of holes on this side and a pair of holes on the other side. The bottom of the box has 4 drainage holes, just in case rainwater did come in through the entrance hole, it'll drain out. And it's important that that drainage is there, or that the corners of that bottom piece are cut out so you have drainage in the corners. Now, what I have done is I've modified this design, and I now cut a slot up at the top on the side, so there's a little bit better airflow there, because it does get quite hot inside of those boxes, especially if they're in full sunlight in the summertime. I've measured temperatures as high as 114 degrees. Now, I have only lost 3 broods, and that was when we had a spell that it was over 100 degrees every day for about a week. And it just simply got too hot in there. I had eggs that didn't hatch, and they were abandoned, and I had a couple of broods of babies that perished. But for the most part, that wood is really pretty insulative, and the babies develop a response where they pant, and they also flap their little wings so they don't get too overheated. So it's good to have your box where you're going to get some afternoon shade if possible, but that's not always possible. So they do seem to manage okay when we are in July and August and it's still awfully hot. Okay, so here's a picture of the box with a little bit different view. This is one of the adopted boxes. Last year, I, through Berry Funder, did an Adopt a Box, nest box program where individuals could adopt a nest box and provide funding that allowed me to buy all new wood, the hinge material, the mounting material. I'm now putting most of these boxes on metal poles, and I'm using metal predator guards, which I'll show you all in a few minutes. But you can see, again, he's checking out that box. She's waiting to see if he approves, and then she'll check it out, and if she approves, then they'll take on that particular box as their own.
It's like human real estate.
Yes, it is. Yeah, yeah. That's hers. She's going to decide whether or not that's the good one. So, I also want to tell you, we think of bluebirds as being sexually monogamous, okay, which means that, like we're supposed to be, that a pair stay together, not necessarily for life, but during an entire season. So male and female stay together for a breeding season. Now, there is some cheating going on, okay? If a females choose the mate, the male will show off and tell her how great he is, but it's up to her to decide. And she's determining how good his genetics are because his genes will influence what the survival of her babies are going to be. So she's going to try to choose the best male she can. She may have to settle for second best if the good males are already chosen. Like she did, yes. I think we all relate to that. And she may go and mate with a better male so that she's providing at least some of her offspring with better genetics. So they're not always the innocent little birds we think they are. And about 30% of the babies in most broods are going to be fathered by some other bird. And that's not that unusual in the bird world, and I guess in our world either, but ideally that's, we would all just stay together, but that's not always the case. Okay, so here's a female bringing in a grasshopper. She's got babies in that particular box, and I've got a type of predator guard that prevents raccoons from being able to reach into the box and take out the babies and the eggs. So she's flying into what we call the front porch, and she's going to feed her babies, which I think in my next picture, you can actually see the little baby's head sticking out of the box, and she's just delivered some food, and she's going to get ready and go off and find some more food for those babies.
So at this point, the baby's almost ready to fledge.
That looks pretty close to fledging because it's able to get up to that entrance hole and look for food. And when they hear mom and dad coming, they get very vocal and they start rattling around inside that. So that one's getting pretty close. I would say, just looking at it, it's probably like day 17. So. And she's one of my banded ones. You can see her little bling there on her leg. And that particular box is box 39, which is in the gallery. All right, now, nest boxes need to have proper placement. I know lots of people have made mistakes of putting nest boxes on trees. I mean, we think of that as a natural place for a cavity to be, and it really is, but unfortunately, bluebirds as well as other birds have predators. And here in Georgia, we have lots of snakes, and especially snakes that are very good at climbing. This is a rat snake. Gray rat snakes are probably the biggest problem I have in terms of predators. Now, cats can also be problematic, of course. Squirrels will go in sometimes if they can gain entrance to a box, and they will actually eat babies. Wrens, Carolina wrens, will go in and take out eggs and very young babies if they can. So there are lots of dangers out there, and you can reduce the loss if you put your nest boxes in a proper position with appropriate predator guards. So here's a very nice looking nest box, has multiple chambers. I'm not sure this one was really meant for bluebirds, but you can see that's something we would like to have in our gardens because it's very attractive. But unfortunately, there's a lot of mistakes that were made here, right? Who can tell me one major mistake that you see? Right, it's on a wooden pole and it doesn't have a predator guard. All right, now, let me tell you, snakes are really good at climbing. A wooden pole is pretty grippy for a snake, but metal poles are too. So a metal pole is not by itself the end-all be-all. All right, so we have a metal, or we have a wooden pole here very easily for that snake to access. Notice it's a pretty tall pole, but snakes are really good at climbing. What's another issue there? Overhanging limbs, right. It's very close to vegetation, and even if there was predator guards on that box, because that snake could go up into the trees that are right behind that box, they will literally climb up the tree and drop on top of that box and then gain access. So you have to move your box pole out away from overhanging vegetation. So out into the yard a little bit more, out into more in the open. Now that's nice because it does provide some shade, but unfortunately with snakes in the area, they're going to get in. They will get in. If they can find a way, they will get in. Okay, so predator guards. Now, predator guards aren't particularly attractive, but they're very, in some cases, effective. Not all of them, but they are effective at keeping out most snakes and most other predators like raccoons. And here are some of the very common ones that you may see and are either available for you to build yourself if you're handy, or you can even purchase some of these. So here we have 3 different types. We have a PVC pipe guard, and notice we have a 4-inch diameter PVC pipe which is suspended underneath the box. And it's a little misleading. I would make this location of the guard and the box higher than is shown there, because if you get a really large snake, it's going to be able to get up that pole and even coil around that PVC. Even though PVC is very slick, some snakes, especially the big ones, are strong enough that they can constrict around that pipe and make their way into the box. So I would have the location of the guard up at least 2 feet off the ground, preferably higher, so that that snake can't reach that location. Then we have the stovepipe guard, and that's currently what I'm using on my boxes that are on metal poles. If after you leave today, if you go out to the meadow, there are 5 nest boxes out there that have this type of predator guard on it. So this is made from a piece of metal stovepipe that you can buy at the hardware store. And in the top, there's hardware cloth, the mesh cloth that would prevent the snake from crawling up the pole and then continuing to go up to the nest box.
Window screen work?
Yeah, like window screen is a little flimsy. It might not hold up all that well. You need something stiff.
And you can get that at Home Depot.
Yeah.
You
Or
can get a lot of it for not much money.
yeah, it doesn't cost very much. Now, it's very prickly to work with. Definitely you want to wear gloves when you're cutting this stuff with tin snips because it gets very, very sharp. So the hardware cloth fits up in the stovepipe, and you cut tabs that you bend over, and that keeps that hardware cloth up in there.
You can put like steel wool stuff up in the pipe.
Yeah, you can. as long as it stays there. That's the problem. You don't want it to fall out. You can see there's a little, it says strapping brackets. That's just plumbing strap that's affixed to the pole, and the mesh rides on that plumbing strap. So it's not like everything is fastened together. It just fits together as a unit. Also, the beauty of this is that this hangs and it can rock back and forth. So it's actually called a rattling stovepipe. And because it's not solid and fixed, if a snake came up and was able to reach over and start to coil around the stovepipe part, because it would swing back and forth, that usually knocks the snake off. So these are generally thought to be about 90% effective at keeping snakes out. And then the one that has been used for a lot of years, and really the stovepipe is better, but there's the sheet metal, it's called a cone baffle. And that's just cut out of a piece of sheet metal in a circle and fastened to the pole. You can see it forms that barrier. Unfortunately, some snakes, if they're large enough, they can climb up that pole and then reach up around it and go in. But that is really, really good at keeping out raccoons.
Renee?
Yes.
Can I say one other thing?
Mm-hmm.
Because we just put a stovepipe baffle on ours, and we could not find the stovepipe stuff at Home Depot, but they do have it at Ace Hardware.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know about
And it is seasonal. They usually will take it out of stock as we get into the springtime. So you can buy it in the fall and the winter when people are putting in stovepipes and find it pretty easily.
So, like our Bluebird boxes are on our poles of our fence.
Mm-hmm.
That's a bamboo, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So how far away should the houses be from the fence? Roughly.
Well, a 4-foot snake is strong enough to extend its body out about 3 feet. So I would try to have it a minimum of 3 feet away from the fence. Now, if you can, or if you want to, I have boxes that I use on fences, and I attach my metal pole to a fence post, and then I have my stovepipe, unfortunately kind of close to the fence. It's not perfect. The snake could still get on that, but because it rattles back and forth, it should knock them off. Unfortunately, your box is going to be really high.
Right, because one night we went to bed, the door was closed.
Mm-hmm.
This morning I get up, the door is open to the house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that something got in.
Mm-hmm.
So, and if you have fence, they're just going to climb right up into that. So I would avoid that if I can.
Can you do a little nail to kind of hold the side to hold the door closed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or take just a screw and just kind of screw it in. Now,
What I was going to do, put it
yeah, raccoons are really good about opening things. And with my top opening box, if I don't have those predator guards on there, I have to wire it closed because they will open it up.
well, I
So,
think our boxes are going to go in metal balls.
yeah, that's really the best thing to do. All right, so there's a picture of a pole that has one of the conical baffles on it. And again, they work pretty well, but they're not going to keep out all snakes, especially the big ones.
Are there other precautions you could take? I know this is, excuse me, oversimplification,
Mm-hmm.
but greasing it or something?
The problem with that grease is that it's sticky and it will dust, especially if you mow the grass. You're going to blow grass on that sticky stuff. There's another stuff called tacky foot that is really sticky, but I've tried that and I have not kept out snakes.
How about chemical type deterrents for snakes?
I don't think they work. I really don't. Dr. Gallagher, well, Dr. Gallagher, who will be coming and talking about white-tailed deer later on in the month, I think in 2 weeks, he's done several studies about trying to dissuade deer using Milorganite, and he has done some studies using Milorganite to dissuade snakes. Problem with that, and it seems to work pretty well. The problem with that, because it is a dissolvable fertilizer, it's a granule, that unless you keep reapplying it and form that chemical barrier, the snakes are going to come back. But most commercial snake deterrents don't work that you put down. But
We use cayenne pepper to keep cats off our porch. But
that,
again, you
yeah,
gotta
snakes
keep it
are,
back out.
snakes are triggering on heat. They can detect infrared. So when they're searching, that heat, we don't see it, but at night or even in the daytime, that box is throwing out heat because those little babies have body heat. And so that box appears warm to them. That's a trigger for them to say, hey, there's food there. And I swear that snakes remember that image and that location, and they will keep coming back. So you might even have to move your box if you're having problems.
Recite my rifle.
Yeah. Well, you know,
I know, that's a whole different problem.
yeah. I've killed snakes. I confess, I have killed them when I've opened a box and there's a snake in there and there's lumps where I know the babies were. I have killed some snakes. Yeah. So there's a very simplistic view of the stovepipe baffle. That's the one that I am using when I'm using metal poles. Now, honestly, all my boxes have not been converted yet. I'm working on that, but that's pretty much what I am using now. And it seems to work pretty well. Also, box 39, come on, you move forward. There we go. Box 39 has this particular type of guard on it. Yeah, this is the wire mesh cage. That's the front porch. And it's called a Noel Guard, and this is a plan, and again, that's out of that hardware cloth material that you can cut with pin snips.
You can get that online, actually.
Yep.
We made them
Yep.
last year.
Yep. Depends on how handy you are and how much work you want to go through, how much trouble. It's not too hard. I know that any hardware store pretty much is going to have this. And you just position it over the nest hole. And the idea here is this does not keep out snakes, but it will prevent raccoons, like on your fence, if your door is closed, from being able to reach in, and they can, if the female's on the nest, they can grab her or they can pull out eggs and babies. And also if a cat, and you know cats jump really well, if they jump up to the top of the box, and they will do that, that gives a little extra extension for the female as she's coming out to realize that there's a problem there, and she'll stay in the box. So it adds a little bit more protection. I have used this on those locations where I can't put in the metal pipes, and it does help to some extent. But again, it does not keep snakes out. All right, so if you want nest box plans or plans for predator guards, there's lots of resources available online. If you're really into bluebirds, there's the North American Bluebird Society. It's a very good organization. They're nonprofit. They hold an annual meeting, a convention every year, and you can go and spend time with a whole bunch of bluebird intensive people. So that's their website, nabluebirdsociety.org. Cialis.org is another good source for information about feeding bluebirds in the wintertime, nest box cams, etc. That particular link is a live nest cam that is being hosted by an elementary school in Kennesaw. So it's kind of in our neighborhood. And I don't think that one's active right now, but they do have some archived video where you can look inside an actual nest box and see what's going on. But if you just Google search nest boxes or predator guards, you'll come up with lots and lots of resources. The North American Bluebird Society also has a really nice newsletter and a journal with good information. All of that is archived on their site. So I highly recommend that as a source of more information. And I have been monitoring Bluebird boxes, or I have had Bluebird boxes on campus since 2002. I was out birding, I was looking for bluebirds and didn't see them, and I realized pretty quickly that it was because we didn't have any natural nesting sites. I could only find 6 pairs. And so my poor husband had to build 50 nest boxes and help me put them up on campus. and that first year we had 38 pairs. So truly, if you build them, they will come, if they're in the right habitat, of course. But right now, I'm developing a bluebird and butterfly trail, partly from some of the money that I got through the Berry Funder program. And you can see this is the hay fields that are on campus, and the little yellow pins are positions where I put nest boxes in on this side. I still have nest boxes to put on the other side, and I have been growing, thanks to two of my students, we are growing native plants that will attract butterflies and other pollinators, and we're going to be planting along that trail, eventually probably put in some interpretive signs and seating, so if people are walking on the Viking Trail and they want to take a detour, they can kind of take that spur and go visit this area where I'm putting in these bluebird boxes. So that's my big focus right now. And I've got probably, I want to say about 46 boxes that are out there right now. But they're being replaced because all of those boxes are 15 years old. They're a little long in the tooth. And so with the Adopt a Nest Box program, I'm able to replace those as I'm getting time to do that. So as I close, I want to thank Gena for the use of her photographs, and also Rachel, who has given me the opportunity to come speak with you. And of course, the staff here at Oak Hill are wonderful. They take beautiful care of the grounds. They've allowed me to put some boxes here on the property. And of course, thank you all for your attention. So with that, I will close. And I'll open the floor for questions. Yes, Gail.
How do you feel about feeding mealworms?
I think that's fine in the wintertime. Mealworms are very, very high in phosphorus, but not so high in calcium. Mealworms are the larva of a grain beetle. You can go to a pet shop and buy a little cup of mealworms. You can also buy them freeze-dried, and I guess you can train bluebirds to consume those. But bluebirds don't recognize a feeder as being a feeder for them unless they see the little wiggly worms. Then they'll get used to it. So I would start with live ones, and then you can probably move to frozen, the freeze-dried ones. And I think that's fine to do in the wintertime because they do contain a lot of fat in their body composition, and that does provide energy for them. I would not feed them during breeding season because of the low calcium, and phosphorus has, unfortunately, an ability to disrupt calcium metabolism, and so I would avoid that then. But I think in the wintertime it's fine.
But during breeding season, it's kind of like being in junk food.
Yeah, it's junk food. Yeah, it is junk food. But, you know, sometimes they need a little extra boost, and it's kind of nice to be able to track them and see them feeding. Now, after the babies have fledged, a lot of people do feed mealworms, but again, I wouldn't have them rely on that food source because of the low calcium. Now, you can grow your own mealworms if you're not too squeamish. You just get a shoe box, put oatmeal in it, and some pieces of carrots or potatoes, and dump in one of those containers of larvae, and they'll go through their life stage. They'll form the little beetles, which don't fly, and then they'll lay eggs, and you'll have mealworms after a while. And it's, you know, just stick it in the basement or the garage. It doesn't smell or anything, and you can have almost a constant supply of these things. So, anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Tell us more about your adopter box.
Okay, so when I started looking at the sad shape of my 15-year-old boxes and realized that I didn't quite have enough money to replace them all, Barry recently started it's sort of like a GoFundMe page on social media called Berry Funder, where different professors, groups, departments could solicit for funds from the general public to support programs. And I proposed this Adopt a Nest box, and Berry Funder said, yeah, that's a great idea. So we launched it in, I think it was April of last year when we actually went live. And individuals could adopt a nest box for $75, and I put a little name plaque that says adopted by whoever, like Gail. Gail adopted one, Marty adopted several, adopted by, and the year, and that's a permanent part of that nest box, and that provides the mounting pole, the materials for the baffle, the hinges, the mounting hardware, and the lumber for a box. And it also provides a little extra so that if that box does need maintenance in the future, like needs to have a part repaired or replaced, I still have funds to do that. It was very successful. I had an individual who matched all of the funds, and I was able to have a good amount of money to not only monitor and keep these boxes maintained, but also support the research that I do with my students on bluebirds. I've got a young lady right now who's working in Bermuda. She's a native Bermudan. They actually have a subspecies of eastern bluebird there, and some of the funding that I have is supporting her research there. She's monitoring that population. And I've done some other work with students here with some of that funding. So fortunately, that came around at the exact great time for me to start replacing these boxes. I just need about 5 of me that can go out and get these things put up. It is kind of labor intensive to go out and mount these boxes. But I'm working on it. It's coming along. And I'm going to try, I shouldn't cross my fingers on knock on wood and everything, I'm going to try to also reestablish the Bluebird nest box cam that I had running a few years ago. But the cameras that go inside the nest boxes are not always user friendly, and I'm trying to find a better system for that. So I'm working on that too, and hopefully I'll have something up maybe by the end of the season or before, so we can see a clutch.
And because you go through there, you do your donation, it's tax deductible.
It is tax deductible.
How's the eastern bluebird population doing now?
It's doing pretty well. In most areas, it has rebounded. Again, if you don't have the right habitat, they're not going to be there. So they're like New Jersey, which is so heavily populated, that population has not rebounded. And here, obviously, with going from 6 to 38 pairs that first year, I have many more bluebirds than that now. As long as you've got the habitat, you've got places to nest, the populations will come back. And also, not using pesticides is very, very helpful. We know that in general, birds are having problems because of habitat loss, pesticide use, etc. So if we can use natural solutions to control pests, then they're going to be much, much better off. Limiting access of cats to the outdoors, using proper types of predator guards, thinking about where your nest box placement is going to be. That's what's really helped bluebirds, and they really have come back.
I just checked, and Amazon has bluebird boxes and kits for anywhere from $25 to $40.
Mm-hmm.
But that
Yep.
doesn't include the mounting and the
Right.
predator guard.
Yeah, yeah. You're going to spend probably about, if you do it yourself, probably around $20 to $40 to build your own. Because you've got to buy a big plank of wood, you've got to cut it, you've got to have the hardware, you need the proper drills. I use and this is important, I use a 1/2-inch Forster bit for my entrance hole. 1.5 inches excludes starlings. Doesn't keep out wrens and house sparrows. They're a major problem in certain locations. But it will keep out cowbirds sometimes, but definitely starlings, which are the biggest pests in terms of bluebirds. So.
I'm in a neighborhood,
Mm-hmm.
and I feed, birds, but I've never seen a bluebird. I did buy some of the freeze-dried
Mm-hmm.
mealworms and kept it out there forever. Nobody was eating any of it,
Right.
and I never saw a bluebird. I bought the blueberry nuggets
Mm-hmm.
and nothing.
They're,
Will they come to my feeder? I mean, does it have to be those?
are you more
ones?
you said you're in a neighborhood. Are you more in town?
I'm in Northwoods.
Northwoods, okay. They may be around, but I bet you they're going to be on the outskirts.
Okay.
And unless it's really wintertime, when they're dispersing and you have the right type of shrubbery with the berries and things, I doubt that you're going to see them. Because usually in the wintertime, the family kind of splits up, and and the male and the female may not necessarily be that close together. So you may get an odd bluebird, but I don't think you're going to get them in any large numbers. And if you think about, this is a bird that feeds on live insects. So they're looking for things that are moving. And if you got this frozen, this freeze-dried, dried-up thing laying there, they don't understand that that's food. They're not seed eaters like other birds are that are attracted to seeds. They want to see something moving. Now you can train them, if they're around, by putting mealworms in a flat container, and they're going to be crawling around and everything. They see that movement, and then they'll start coming and saying, okay, here's food. And they learn that that platform means food, and you can start putting in some of the freeze-dried, and they'll pick them up and say, okay, there's food here, and then they'll probably come back. Yes?
Box placement, as far as my neighbor has some in his yard.
Mm-hmm.
He told me they need to face a certain direction and they have to be so many feet apart. What is that?
Well, they do need to be separated by some distance, because pairs are very, very territorial, and they will fight each other. I've seen females knock each other to the ground and continue to fight. So they do need to be spaced apart. Mine are 150 meters apart. And so I do have them stacked on fence posts or power line poles in some cases, but I try to keep them as far apart as I can. Now, as far as, okay, that's spacing. What was the other? Oh, okay, direction. All right. A lot of people say they should be facing certain directions. One year we did a study where we were using power line poles that they were the great big transmission lines that have the double poles, and we put one box facing due east and one box facing due west, because we thought, okay, they're going to choose a box based on internal temperature going in, and this was early in the spring when it was still rather cold. Well, one pair chose east and the other pair chose, well, on another set of poles, the other pair chose west, and then when they reclutched, it was the other way around. So I don't think there's any rhyme or reason to how you need to position your box. Now, if your whole, I would say if you have a choice, if you can position the front of the box facing east, so in the late afternoon that hot sun is not hitting on the front of the nest box, and you've got more, it's a little bit more ventilation in that case. But as far as the bird's preference, I don't really think it matters. As long as there's a box there, and especially if there's no natural nesting sites, they'll go in it. I've seen them inside little newspaper slots. I've seen them inside mailboxes. I've seen them inside weird things that just happen to have a hole. So if they're really desperate, they really do not care which direction that hole's facing.
It's more of the glide path.
Yeah, you want to have, an open area so that they can fly in. If they've got to avoid all of this stuff to get in, they're probably not going to like it as much unless there's a nice perch they can fly to and then go in. So. Anyone else? Yes?
Yeah, does your banding program show that most of the birds who fledge there or banded there stay in that?
Pretty much they'll stay in the general area. And Barry, is very, very large. I have some boxes out at Possum Trot, and then I have some boxes in the cattle pastures that border the highway, and I have some on main campus too. And I've had a few birds that hatched over here make it out to Possum Trot, but generally they stay in the same area. The females are going to leave. They're going to go farther away because we don't want them mixing up with their dads and their brothers. So they're going to go further away. The males tend to stay in more of the same area. I have some pairs that use the same box all the time, every year, or at least that male or that female, because they will exchange mates from season to season. I have some pairs that they change every single brood. So it just kind of depends on the bird's personality. But generally, they will disperse and seek out other individual territories, but it's not usually too far away. Yes.
A question, and it didn't happen this year, but last year I actually emailed you to get some information. We had, of course, the bluebirds had nested, and they had nested successfully prior years with several broods. And something got in the nest last year, and we found the female on the ground dead. What would it have been that did not eat the bird, that just got it and drug it out?
It was probably a house sparrow came in. House sparrows are really, really aggressive. If they can get in and there's a mom in the nest box or babies or eggs, they will kill them.
Well, and of course she was dead and the babies were still there, and I was concerned and emailed you, and you thought that, but it was real interesting that the father would not feed them, but he did.
Okay.
About 3 days, but then my husband got up early and the babies were on the ground, so probably a bird.
Yeah, it was
'Cause if
probably
it had
some
a
bird.
A hungry cat, a hungry cat,
They would have carried it off.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or, you know,
A raccoon, you would have found just nothing but feathers.
or
But,
a snake.
yeah. So it's probably some type of bird.
And we've seen
Yeah.
birds trying to nest there before the bluebirds.
Yeah. Yeah, house sparrows are really bad.
nesting.
I've had to move or just take nest boxes out of a location that had house sparrows because they are so aggressive. You cannot keep them out. They're so small. They get in that 1.5-inch hole. It's easy because they're smaller than bluebirds. But bluebirds are not particularly good about defending a nest box. They would rather leave than fight. Of course, they'll fight each other, but they won't fight off other birds. I've had tree swallows displace bluebird pairs. So it was probably some type of bird. I would suspect house sparrows because finding the dead female. Wrens will go in and take out eggs and take out little tiny babies if they can carry them out. So they can be really bad. A lot of people will have no success with bluebirds if there's too many Carolina wrens around. Now there's a funny wren guard that you can attach to the box. It kind of hides the entrance hole from the wrens, and that seems to work pretty well, but it doesn't keep the bluebirds from going in and out. But wrens can be a big problem.
And another thing that I observed starting this winter that I had never noticed before, and I always told my daughter, you never saw bluebirds at your seed feeders. But the whole winter long, we had a pair, and they would come and eat the seeds out of the...
They were eating seeds or they were eating berries?
Well, I don't know.
Was it a berry mix?
Mixture, so
Okay, there's probably berries in it. You can get suet cakes that have berries in it, and they'll sometimes feed on that.
That's
So.
interesting. She's not eating
Yeah, that's a bit unusual.
They're probably eating the
Yeah.
berries, but, and we see them now.
Well, good.
I found a male bluebird on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just perfect.
Well,
And I took it to the health department
Uh-huh.
because they wanted all birds that were insect feeders.
right.
And they checked it over and they said just died of old age.
Yeah.
And somehow we don't think of
Well,
birds dying
yeah,
of
they
old
do
age.
die of old age at times. And there is a species of tick that feeds exclusively on birds. And this particular tick will attach on the head somewhere, usually around the ear. And the tick can produce a toxin that causes paralysis. I've found females dead inside of the box, starved to death with the tick still attached. Now that's not that common, and it's also cyclical. It's like these ticks become common only every 3 years or so. And they don't feed exclusively on bluebirds, they will attach to other birds too. But that's something else that can sometimes happen.
Well, there wasn't
Yeah.
anything they could find wrong.
Yeah.
They just-
We're kind of lucky here because there's also something called a blowfly, and it's more of a problem up north than it is here. And these flies lay their eggs in the nesting material, and then the maggots, the larvae, come out, and they'll actually attach to the babies and feed on them. And I have never found those in any of my bluebird boxes. So we seem to be in the right area where we don't have those. So there are lots of things that can affect them, and unfortunately, only about 25% of any babies that make it out of the nest will survive their first year. That's just the way nature is. It's very harsh out there. So even though I have banded tons of bluebirds, there are not tons of bluebirds here. There's always going to be loss. And when you're living 6 years, eventually, you know, your time comes too. But in general, they're doing good.
Are the babies sexually mature at what age?
Well, they're not going to be able to reproduce until their next season. So even though they may look fully adult, they're not going to start their own brood unless they were produced. If they were really, really, really early in the season, which maybe if they fledged at the end of March, they could, but probably not. So. All right, anybody else? Okay, well then thank you all so very much.